Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Hinton from DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK, and Jesper Ryanen. Is that right?
Close enough, yeah.
Okay.
Not bad, not bad.
I'm afraid my Finnish is rubbish. So, from Grafogame in Finland. So we are going to talk today about the importance of research or evidencing for EdTech and what that really means, because as some of us know, there are quite a lot of different approaches that are valid to do this. And there are certain trends in the EdTech industry that sort of seem to be quite predominant. So can I start with you, Rachel, with sort of highlighting a little bit about what DFID is doing in the kind of EdTech sphere and how DFID is approaching that also from a research perspective, either to support the EdTech evidence or also to support your own research. So over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's a real honour to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from a EdTech startup as well and how they're tackling research. I wanted to talk to you about three things today. The first is the difference between user research and academic research, as we use it in DFID. Secondly, I wanted to give an example of an organisation that has used both of these very practically and very impressively. And thirdly, I wanted to give you news about how DFID is moving to be a global leader in the EdTech research space with the launch of EdTech Hub. So, on user research, how many people here know what I actually mean by user research? Just a show of hands of, okay, great. So a lot of you, and that's not really surprising because it's an approach that's really familiar to most tech startups. It's a type of ethnographic research that's very iterative, and it really helps with product development. It's often used in digital service development and so on. But what it doesn't do is tell us about necessarily the learning outcomes and the end impacts that we're seeking. On the other hand, the sort of academic gold standard research is often what the donors are striving for, and that is much more rigorous, robust. It usually takes a long time. It often involves peer review. It may be RCTs that need control groups and so on. And donors, or certainly DFID, perhaps aren't as good as that iterative type of product development type research. And yet actually, in this EdTech space, we're going to need both of those running side by side if we want to make progress. We know from our program of RISE, research into improving systems of education. It's a research program run out of the School of Government in Oxford. Lant Pritchett is the lead of that. And it shows just how difficult it is at the systems level, how complex the system can be to take the kind of tech startups we've been hearing about today with all of these pictures, taking those things to scale. And yet we know that you need the innovation to work as well as the system in which you're trying to take it to scale. So,
can I
get
Jesper to just respond to that from your perspective, to sort of how you would approach, obviously very different type of organizations. You make products, you build products based on research and evidence, and obviously you're looking at research from a very, very different perspective. But obviously somewhere the two of them have to meet. So Jesper, can you just highlight us a little bit, having heard what sort of Rachel says, how you as an EdTech company start looking at research, why, and why you also might be adopting a particular methodology, and where you sit on that user versus academic scale?
Well, as an EdTech company, we're definitely engaging in both. But I think there is a bit of an illusion with the barrier of entry into academic research. I think it conjures up images of having to, deal with year-long, donor struggles, and then having to deal with, picky academics. But actually, I found that there are more and more funds made available by governments and NGOs and donors where they want to actually academically research end products. and that there's a bit of a trend that I've seen certain top-level academics talk about, is that they're a bit frustrated about researching a tool or a game, and then it's just left in the glove compartment. No one ever touches it because of the complexity of legal structures between universities and companies. I'm finding that universities are warming up to small companies commercializing their research. They're becoming much more open-minded towards that, and they see things from our perspective much better than I believe they have before. And I think this is a definite trend that we've seen happening.
I can see Rachel nod with some enthusiasm. So Rachel, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah. No, I'm just moving to the next slide here, because I would totally agree that it doesn't have to be difficult. And indeed, the example you see behind me on the slide is the example of a UK tech startup, 1 billion. How many of you know 1 billion? Yeah. Great. A lot of people, and not surprising because they're in the top, shortlisted the top 5, I think, for the Elon Musk Prize, and they've done a good job of getting support both from DFID and other donors. They started in 2014 in Malawi. And what's really impressive about the way they worked was, from the beginning, they recognized they needed both types of this research. And so they partnered with a very, very high-quality research team, Nicola Pickford from University of Nottingham and her team. And within the first year, they had already got 2 papers out. So exactly, just to point there, that you don't have to wait 4 years before you put a publication out in a top quality journal. What's interesting, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, is that what they're doing now is they realize that the costs are also very important. We heard in a panel earlier in this very room from the Minister of Ghana saying, you know, what he cared about was both how easy the products are to use, but also what they cost. They're dealing with a really resource-constrained environment, and it isn't that you can just, you know, it isn't just whether it works, it's whether it works at what cost. And yet I think that tech companies struggle to capture costs sometimes, and certainly we've been very bad as a sector in capturing costs in a way that's comparable. So, for example, the global group on building evidence in education, the BE2 group, that's a consortium of the World Bank, UNICEF, the foundations, is just in the process of finalizing a guide for those wanting to do research in how you could capture costs that take into account, you know, the recurrent costs, but also initial startup costs.
And if I may add to that, the English version of Graphogame was research in collaboration with the Center for Neuroscience in Education at the University of Cambridge. Right. And one thing you notice about academic language in the final evaluation reports is that they do not speak to the consumer that actually purchases them. Teachers or school administrators, I don't believe when they look at a extremely academically written report, that they don't often get the how big the impact is really. And my example here is the fact that we made our English Graphogame version, and what was interesting about it was that it showed, in the language it says, it shows no progress, literacy progress over business as usual. It just says business as usual. However, when you go into the Education Endowment Foundation's sort of category descriptions, you see business as usual means small group activities with a teacher or one-to-one activities, which are extremely expensive, and they have not given it a price. But a small group activity of a teacher, teaching early grade literacy to a group of 4 children or 5 or 6, compared to an app being able to keep up with that, is actually a massive insight. And our app costs 10 quid. So, and it can reach the same sort of base level as business as usual. And that's actually, I think, a very big insight, a very important insight that the research has shown. But it doesn't, we have to explain it. And,
Because I mean, what you raise is like a really interesting issue, because to me, and I might be a bit controversial here, but you're starting not even to compare apples and pears, but you're actually doing apples and lemons, because it sort of leaves a bit of a sour taste in the mouth, having that kind of comparison that doesn't make sense anymore. Yet it's kind of research driven. And that's where I sometimes, I mean, I'm a great believer in evidencing and research, don't get me wrong, but that's where I quite often struggle with the concept of research for EdTech, because you've just given us a prime example. The other thing I kind of struggle with at times is EdTech is also about innovation and hopefully some level of transformation of education, because it ain't working very well at the minute. And so that tension that you then start getting between the research and the evidencing, which you may not have been able to do before you kind of go into your EdTech product launch. For a lot of startups, that's like a fundamental issue, because you might not have the funding even to do a small research trial to kind of do that rapid iteration of research. So how do you both kind of feel about that? Have I kind of set the cat amongst the pigeons here or not?
I'll just quickly, if you don't mind, I'll quickly just say that for us, it's actually just fine. The risk of doing academic research is not that high as expected, really. Because of the existence of so many donors, what I often do is I help researchers write up the grant papers, and they get the grants, and I'm helping them out, and we are a contractor to them. And we just immediately get started, and it cost me, it's sweat equity on my part. We just did an intervention study with 400 children in Holland, and it cost us, I calculated it in terms of sweat equity, 2,000 euros, and 400 kids.
Startups in the room, you might just want to take note of this sweat equity concept for research. It may, do you some good. So, Rachel, what about you?
I think there's a lot of untapped partnerships out there, and I actually think that there are a lot of academics who perhaps haven't worked in the context that you're working in, who haven't got the global reach that you all have, who actually would be really interested in having those kind of partnerships to go out and have a look at the real challenges you're facing. I think this example of 1 billion is also fascinating, because their research there showed it was such good impact. It's software that helps with literacy and numeracy. And in 8 weeks of a dosage of a daily dose, those children had learned as much maths as they would in a whole year of normal teaching. And it's so good that it actually came back to Oxford. So the picture behind is our Minister of State in my hometown of Oxford, visiting schools where they then had sort of reverse learning back to Oxford. And that wouldn't have happened had it not been for 1 billion being open to and kind of creative with those partnerships in the way you said, to bring researchers on board. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's this funding may very well come from elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So I'm now going to set the second cat amongst the pigeons, probably. RCT. It seems to be like the holy grail when, people talk about research. Now, the concept of RCT came from strict scientific background, and applied sciences background. Education kind of sits somewhat on a different spectrum because of its contextualization. So if you go to a classroom, even within London, you go to 2 schools, they'll be very, very different. So never mind, trying to kind of address that in different countries and resource poor versus resource rich, all the stuff that we're talking about here. So how do you kind of approach the RCT, and aren't there maybe smaller but more effective ways of researching EdTech propositions from both the DFID perspective as well as your perspective?
Well, I think this is going to sound very simplistic, but small-scale RCTs. So one thing we have at Graphogame is certain language versions that we have, like Swahili, or Chinyanja in Zambia, have often actually been, rather than been university-driven research, they've actually been even master's level theses. And what I've noticed about these young researchers is that they make it their pet project. They put their heart and life into it, and we've done really small scale RCTs. Like in Indonesia, I believe they had 12 children only, and we're not claiming that's our evidence base. This is proven to be true. The security of the findings is very low, but it gets us started. It's sort of like a prototype of research. Armed with that small-scale study, we can go to larger and larger donors and say, look, this is looking promising, let's strengthen this.
So how do you deal with controls then, in terms of, and the comparison of the...
Well, we are not researchers, so we
yeah,
don't do this. See? No, but I will say that I'm not exactly sure how they do the randomization.
Okay.
When you read through the research, they've all had different methodologies. But this is generally something that we leave to the third-party independent researcher as a cop-out.
Point taken. Thank you. Okay. Would you like to add something to this, Rachel?
Sure. I mean, I think at DFID we feel it's actually really important that we have a range of different methods, and it depends on the question that you want to answer as to which method is appropriate. And in a way, education's been a little bit slow to adopt the rigorous research method, and it has in fact been used really successfully to prove using the difference with it is that it has to have a control, and so you're able to categorically be able to say this was the impact of our intervention. Obviously in real world, as we were being challenged there by Carla, that can be quite tricky to match your samples if you're creating a control, one group's got the intervention and the other doesn't have the intervention, because there's so many other interventions coming in. How do you know whether it was the impact of your particular intervention that had the effect? But as we've heard, there's a lot of really excellent academics. The JPAL lab is one that we have invested in quite a lot in education, and they've come out with some fantastic evidence to show us research that really works. So we have a paper in DFID at the moment called The Best Buys, and what this shows is actually there are some really top, the mega buys, as Rachel Glenister calls them, the things that we really know would make a difference if you invested in them, like the curriculum being at the right level for the children, rather than the curriculum that's pitched so high that half of the class is not even understanding what the teacher is teaching, and yet they transition to the next stage and the next stage. So no wonder at the end of primary school we've got 387 million who can't even have basic literacy by the time they leave. So we do feel there's this spectrum. I mean, another lovely example, some of you might know STIR. Sharaf Javan is here talking on some of the other panels, and they used a randomized controlled trial to look at whether intrinsic motivation could shift learning, and they showed that with a control. Now, that's something that many people are very skeptical about. It's always about, it needs more money for teachers, and that's what will make the difference. And unless you can give a minister or a donor the evidence for their decision-making, it's very hard to shift very deeply held and embedded views. We all think it's about more inputs. Well, the RISE program shows us it isn't. Inputs correlate very poorly to learning outcomes. And so when our EMIS system is measuring, giving us data on what the walls are made of, what the floor's made of, how many schools there are, how many buildings there are, those aren't the things that matter. It's the softer things, the coaching, this motivation of the teachers and so on.
At this point, I think it might be opportune to open the discussion to the room, if you're happy with that. So anyone got any observations, questions? We would love to hear from you. Yeah, second row there.
I think everyone... I think I could say without the microphone. So thanks for the presentation thus far. I'm Mike from Usat Mobile, based here in Dubai. On the research question, what do you guys think about investing public money in the research of a private product? Because the intellectual property is going to be held most of the times by private companies. And if you're saying this is about laying a foundation for scale, that private company can increase their price anytime they feel like. So what do you do about that?
Oh, I guess I'm the one to answer this.
And the donor
No,
as
of course. That's an ethical issue we bump into regularly. And for example, there's a fund in Chile that was willing to fund us, and then found out about this, our proprietary source code thing. And one of the requirements was that the end product needs to be open source. And we personally believe that. Putting public funds into private sector businesses is not necessarily as controversial as you might think. This is something that governments do regularly to prop their economies. And the amount of money that is actually put into proving a product that it helps children learn how to read, the money that they put into that is minuscule compared to the money that they put into, for example, bailing banks out. So I know it's not necessarily an answer, but I would say on an ideological level, I would say that it is not necessarily something that is that strange that public funds go into supporting us in the private sector.
Can I just let Rachel respond as well?
So
we'll come to you.
My next slide might help answer this. I'm in absolute agreement that actually at the end of the day, it's about whether if you're creating products that will save governments money in the long run, then absolutely we need to be supporting innovation and inspiring and catalyzing the innovation. And that's why DFID is actually about to launch in May an education technology hub, a research hub, which is a £20 million investment over 8 years, because we think it sometimes, it does take time to do these things and to iterate and to learn, and then to learn at scale. And this is being done in partnership with the World Bank. And it has these 3 strands. So it has an innovation strand, which is absolutely about supporting and catalyzing, but at the same time having iterative learning, along with an at-scale research strand that's more robust research. And then a central hub that will help support and be a call-down service to countries or tech providers who are wanting to try and look at and really test out and are serious about getting evidence behind their product, including the costs.
I recommend that those who weren't here check on YouTube tomorrow whether the panel on how politicians can help accelerate EdTech with Minister Prempeh from Ghana and former State Secretary from Mohammed from Kenya. I highly recommend on this question that you maybe go and look at that panel, because there were some interesting discussions around that as well, and there were some very interesting answers on it. So I would recommend that you check tomorrow whether it's been recorded and on YouTube, because you might also find the panel itself really, really interesting. Kirsten.
Hi, Kirsten from Buzu. I just wanted to, was it you who made the point just now about, I think, trust and the financing of research? So I represent a private company, and we have paid for efficacy research into our product because it's very specific research, and frankly, we would never get an academic or government institution to do that research for us. It's too specific, and they have other concerns, it's expensive. So really paying for that research to be done was the only route for us. But I've seen teachers be very critical of that approach, and I totally understand why. I just wanted to kind of come back and say, for us, there was no other option. So I really welcome DFID taking steps in this direction, and any steps in this direction. We would love to have truly independent RCT-based research into our product. It's just not currently possible for us.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. A question here at the front.
Thank you. I want to know, what's the impact of the academic research in terms of development of the product? And then the other thing is, a lot of research around education has been more idiographic because of the nature of education. But we're now working on a scale where we can actually start to understand learning differently because of the large numbers of people we're dealing with on these sorts of apps. So I wonder what the impact is there on our understanding of learning and education more generally. How these things
as in what the research has, how has it impacted us as a company, or
So are you using this research that's coming out to influence how you improve your product? I assume you are, but Is
Yeah.
that what's happening?
Well, so in our English version, I think that's the best example. We did one iteration. So we made we had the Finnish language methodology for our literacy game, and we approached the academics in Cambridge to localize it into the English language. And we created a basic grapheme phoneme correspondence game that was, just basically a translation of the Finnish version. It was studied. It was research. They did an intervention study on that, and they found that there was almost a negative effect, actually. And that we went back to the drawing board, shocked by the results. But then extremely informed about exactly where the mistakes were. We knew exactly what parts of the game were ineffective, which parts were effective. And actually, after that, the iteration was surprisingly easy. It happened very fast. And we basically changed, I think, 60% of the content, and so the 40% stayed. And now in the next research, it's not good enough in my opinion still, but we got great feedback on the second evaluation that we did, which showed us that Graphogame does not work properly unless unless there is a rich oral curriculum and syllabus surrounding it, and that Graphogame on its own will not do anything. That you need to have, a good teacher. The context needs to be there. So I'm not sure if it answers your question entirely, but it constantly it gives us insights with which to make better business decisions and how to make better products for teachers specifically. And that's what we actually try to do. We're not trying to make literacy games for kids. We're making them for teachers, and we're listening to what teachers are commenting about the game and how they're engaging with it. So we wouldn't get that with user research, really, in this level.
So I'd like to, first to the lady, sorry I didn't catch your name, but if anyone is interested in knowing more about the EdTech Hub, please do give me your cards, and Jamie Proctor, who leads this work in my team, would be very keen to get in touch with you and let you know more. But to answer the question at the macro level, so I'm interested in all of this learning, and what does that mean for governments at scale? And to give you one small example, IPA in Ghana did a piece of research on early childhood, and one of the findings of that RCT was that actually what was working and having impact at the scale they were doing it, in terms of young children and using a new pedagogy for learning, didn't then translate into impact when they went to scale. And one of the reasons was that the head teachers weren't supporting and monitoring the use and giving feedback to their teachers in that use. And that learning didn't just help with that program, but actually the government of Ghana took on that lesson and changed the teacher training TTEL program they had to bring that learning into thinking about how to strengthen the skills of head teachers. And so learning can, it can have also impact that is much bigger and going to have wider, repercussions.
Okay, we've got time for one final question.
Thank you very much, panelists. I think research is an interesting area.
We can't hear you very well.
Very interesting, and I come from Uganda. I'm from Uganda. Is one of the challenging areas for third world countries is research. And today, research in our countries is largely based on an attempt to look for a funding, and with the civil society emerging as key actors in education and other fields, you find that we look at what funders want to pay for rather than what is really most likely to be the need of the people of that country. So the researchers now are very, very biased towards saying what is trending among the funders. And I think this becomes a very, very, very big challenge to research. And that explains why many well-recommended researchers, when they go to implementation, they really fail. I have not seen how feedback from the intended beneficiaries. Now, he has said user research is toward targeting the teacher. How are we targeting that learner, that student, to get feedback before we do the final recommendation that this can actually work? So that is my big challenge, and I have seen it.
Yeah.
In our countries.
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you. Who would like to answer to this? Yeah, both of you?
I think it's an excellent question, and I think there are two parts to that. And having visited Uganda recently and looked at the data you have there, I think we've got an issue also with feedback flows on data within the country, and tech could really, really help at the very fundamental level of the system. So when your government is trying to look at which schools are failing, which teachers are turning up, we know we've got high levels of teacher absenteeism, but we don't necessarily, if you go to a school, they don't get the data that they feed back to the centre, back to district level or to school level. And so it's a one-way traffic of data. And tech could really help if, instead of paper and pen and feeding this all in a manual way, smart tech could really help speed up those accountability channels. But to your challenge around whether the research being done is useful to the countries, I think that is a huge problem. And one of the best examples of changing this I've seen is actually in India, where inside the Ministry of UP, they've actually put themselves what they call an evidence lab inside government. So they, instead of sending the data back to the capital, they actually use and analyze the data themselves, say, what's this telling us? Why are these schools failing? Why are those not? What questions do we need answered? And then they commission the research themselves from inside government. And another member of my team is actually working on a program called Knowledge Systems Strengthening to try and give an opportunity to countries, governments who want to set up evidence labs inside their own ministries to support them with the skills they need to utilize their own and analyze their own data better and commission research that is useful.
Jesper, I'm really sorry, we're running out of time. But what I suggest is you're both here, you're all here. We need to move on to the next panel quite soon. Yeah. But obviously people can come and talk to you, I take it.
Absolutely.
So please do, and I would like to thank you both very, very much for joining us for willing to do this panel. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.